Welcome back, welcome back. The leaders of the richest nations in the world meet on the Japanese island of Hokkaido next week for the annual Group of Eight G8 summit. But what is the actual point of the G8? What results do such high-level meetings actually achieve? Or is it just a chummy meeting with a few fellow world big hitters? Someone who should know, and does know, I'm sure he knows, is Bill Emmott, because he's the former editor of The Economist, and it's well known that the editor of The Economist has to know everything that's going on, isn't it?
Well, he at least has to give the impression that he knows. Absolutely.
Very good. But I mean, I think a lot of us have people have the picture of one of these gatherings as being that there are some documents that were prepared by junior people months or weeks before, and they all have a chat, the senior people, and then they issue the junior people's memos from a few weeks before, and nothing really happens of dramatic worth at such an occasion. Is that true?
I think that is more or less accurate. The way I think about these summits is that they are largely pointless, but if they didn't exist, people would be rushing to invent them. Right. Despite the fact that they are largely pointless, because it makes us feel better, the thought that the leaders of the most powerful countries in the world do talk to each other and do get together to discuss world affairs on a regular basis. Really, the process of these summits is, in fact, defined by those junior officials and the piece of paper that they produce, because really the summit is just the final sort of fanfare at the end of a process of negotiation that goes on for months. I think the focal question at recent summits has been, do you or don't you get on with George W. Bush, of which the number in the don't get on has been larger and larger as years have gone on, of course. Now, the key thing with this summit in Hokkaido is that it's the last one of George W. Bush. It's therefore a problematic group for the Japanese to run, because the topic they've chosen to focus on is the environment, and nobody's really going to come to any deal until there's a new American president elected, whether it's Obama or McCain, who will then take a clear position on climate change and the environment. So it's a particularly funny summit, this one.
The price of oil and the price of food in all the papers all the time. Is there anything they can do in those 3 days about that, do you think?
Well, the odd thing about this summit, actually, is that probably the people who might be able to do something aren't actually there, formally speaking. They are the Chinese, who are buying all the oil and consuming it and have an inflation problem as a result. The Saudis, who produce it and should be producing more.
India?
India, who are demanding more and more oil. These people are actually being invited to dinner at the summit. But
they are observers, are they?
They're observers. They're not part of the main negotiation. So they will be there, but they're not part of the main thing. But they should be there if you're going to talk seriously about these subjects.
And they're more relevant than Canada, maybe, or the new countries, India and China.
Well, I think so.
Not just Canada. I'm not picking out Canada, but...
No, nothing wrong with Canada.
Nothing
absolutely.
wrong with Canada, yeah.
Or Italy, yeah. Who other people say should be dropped from this. But I think, basically, a new president and, hopefully, some of his equivalents in European countries should put their heads together next year and say, look, come on, this G8's a bit of a nonsense, isn't it? We need China there. We need India there. We need Brazil. We need Saudi Arabia, probably. You know, we need some of these big developing countries, because otherwise we're irrelevant without them.
And do you think by the time they meet again, the world will be a better place economically or not?
I actually think it probably will be.
Good.
By the time they meet next time. I think the key problem now is inflation in Asia. I think the key obstacle to doing something about it is the Beijing Olympics in August, because the Chinese government is the one that needs to crack down on its inflation, and that'll set the lead for everyone else, probably revalue its currency and that, and it's not going to do anything that shakes the boat in Chinese terms until after the Olympics. So the autumn of this year, they'll take action. Hopefully that might mean we've got cheaper oil by the time we come to the summit next year.
Thank you for an upbeat conclusion. Good to see you again.
Very good to see you.
Last week saw the trial of Simon Mann, the former British officer accused of orchestrating a coup in Equatorial Guinea. Mann was at the dangerous edge of an industry that ranges from multi-million-pound multinational private security companies to misguided adventurers looking to make a living out of a killing here or there. I'm joined now today by Andy Bearpark, the Director General of the British Association of Private Security Companies. That's him. And we're also joined by Dr. Paul Cornish, Head of the International Security Programme at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, to discuss how this fast-growing industry could be regulated. Should it be regulated? All of that to come. Andy, just a lightning thing in this particular case, what do you expect to be the outcome of the dramatic case?
I think that we're reaching the end of the Simon Mann saga. He served his time in Chikurubi in Zimbabwe. His case has been heard in Equatorial Guinea. I would expect that they'll be announcing a jail sentence within the next day or two even. And then, yes, he will have to serve time in jail in Equatorial Guinea. But from what we saw last week at the trial, the prosecutor has dropped the demand for the extortionately long sentence. So hopefully the end of the road is in sight now for Simon Mann. For the Equatorial Guinea authorities, I suspect they've still got a long haul ahead of them, because what they will want to do now is go after the other people who are alleged to have been involved as well.
Now, at this particular point, Paul, obviously this case is rather at the extreme of the private security business, in the sort of adventurer, rascal category, rather than the very, very well organised category. I mean, private security around the world, in Iraq, for instance, I mean, private security there plays a big role, doesn't it?
I think it does. I think it plays a huge role. And as you say, you know, there's a vast range of operations going, from the soldier of fortune, if you like, that kind of the classic mercenary operation, all the way through to things that we don't hear very much about in the news, but there are companies doing what I would argue are extremely worthwhile and worthy things in Iraq, guarding aid convoys and facilities and all those sorts of things, and they classify in some sense as a private security company, but clearly they're miles apart from the sort of operation that we've just been talking about.
But at the same time, if you look back and you think, why in previous wars were they not required? Why are private security firms required to do, in many cases, things that soldiers could do in Iraq?
Well, there's a set of explanations, really, and they tend to be in the following. I mean, what we're seeing in the Western world are things like the so-called peace dividend after the Cold War and so on, and retrenchment in defence spending. Armed forces in Europe and so on are shrinking massively, so there's simply fewer soldiers to go around. There's also, I think, what really is important is a sense that that we don't want to put our troops in harm's way, in line of fire, if we can possibly avoid it. And so if actually we can trade out some of the business of conflict and risk to a private sector that doesn't seem to mind to want to do it, then that kind of makes sense, really.
So it's outsourcing the danger of getting killed, in a way.
It's outsourcing that danger, but it's also just outsourcing a business activity. And it's often useful not to look at private security companies as anything special, but just to say what's happened in our society over the last 50 years in every field. And if you look at the NHS now, the NHS contracts out services like cleaning. In the old days, or what we think of as the old days, the state tended to do these things. What we're seeing now is militaries behaving in the same way and saying we will retain the core warfighting capacity, which it is the right and obligation of a state to pursue, but we'll contract out the rest.
But is it more expensive? I mean, is it more expensive for us having private security companies doing these things in Iraq than having soldiers do it?
Generally speaking, it will be cheaper to be using the private security company.
Why? Why?
Because you're not maintaining a standing force for a long period of time. The rates per day that people see, we all see them in the newspapers and they say, these guys get paid a fortune. They don't get paid a fortune, but of course they do get paid more than a regular soldier. But they're only paid that money while they're on the active operation, while they're out in Iraq protecting the convoy or whatever it may be. Whereas we as a nation have to pay our army year in, year out to keep it trained up and ready.
I think, Andy, if I may, Andy's absolutely right on this. I mean, during the 1990s, the British Armed Forces saved an awful lot of money by contracting out things that seem to be, less front line and logistics. Decades ago, we would have thought that army logistics, support and delivery of ammunition, all that kind of stuff, would have been done by soldiers. It's not, increasingly, it's not done by soldiers anymore. It's done by private contractors who therefore can be brought in when they're needed to provide what's needed, and then when they're not needed, they're not being paid.
But then what about the rules of engagement, and what about the question of regulation? I mean, does that work, or has that got to be worked on?
I think it's got to be worked on. I mean, this is really, I'm not a lawyer, but this does seem to me to be an area that is, to say the least, opaque in international. Exactly what is the status of some of these people in certain circumstances? If, for example, you're a private military or security contractor carrying weaponry and you're guarding something that, let's say it's a military telecommunications centre, then you could arguably be said to be part of a military effort and therefore to be a legitimate military target. If when you finish your shift, you go back to your hotel, you become a civilian again. So there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly what your status is in a theatre of war. And I think lawyers would agree that this does need to be sorted out.
Do you agree with that, in fact?
I entirely agree with that, but I'd go one step further. There are laws out there. Yes, in a few cases, and Paul knows them and tells them very, very well, we could do with greater clarification. But what I think the crying need is for implementation of those laws. The reality is that if a contractor misbehaves, a terribly innocent word, if he misbehaves in Baghdad and shoots somebody wrongly, the reality is that there are quite a few laws that could be used to prosecute that person and put him in jail for the rest of his life. But what we don't have is the capacity to do that. And I mean, one obvious example is that if the person is British, he's actually committed an offence under British law. He can be hauled up to the Old Bailey as was, and you can have the trial and lock him away and throw the key away. But you're never going to do it because the Metropolitan Police are not going to be getting on that plane out to Baghdad and collecting the evidence that a British court would require. So I think the laws in the main are there. Yes, we need some clarifications, as Paul rightly says, but what we desperately need is a capacity to implement those laws.
But it's not out of hand yet, is that the point you're saying?
I think it's not. I mean, I agree with Andy. It is a myth that this is a sort of lawless environment, that it's bandit country, it's the Wild West or something. It is a myth that this is the case. But I think we're agreeing that we just need to think this through more carefully.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us anyway and putting this label on it. And we'll see what the developments are in the short term, medium term and long term. Thank you. Thank you both very much indeed. Well, we're coming towards the end of our second season here. In fact, in the next 2 weeks, we've got 2 special shows of highlights from the past few months, and then we'll take a summer break and we'll be back with our third season in September. That's the plan. Highlights next week. Until then, all the best.